Viewers, drop your location and the local time down in the comments. Let's see where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. Now picture this, a quiet Michigan morning, the lake still wrapped in mist, and Jack Harrison standing on the porch of the cabin he'd just inherited from his grandfather. After 20 years with SWAT, he thought retirement meant trading flashbangs for fishing rods, blueprints, and a little peace. What he didn't count on was inheriting the most power-hungry HOA president north of the Mason-Dixon line. Her name was Karen Whitmore. And the first thing she carried to his door wasn't a pie or a welcome basket. It was a clipboard thick enough to qualify as body armor. She rattled off rules about mailbox height, flower varieties, and garbage can schedules like she was auditioning for a role as the world's most boring auctioneer. Jack could almost hear his old sergeant whisper, "Stay frosty, Harrison. This one's not playing checkers." He chuckled at the absurdity until the violations started landing on his door like bad Yelp reviews after a restaurant health scare. Mailbox 3 inches too tall. Citation. Cedar stain on the cabin that had been there since 1962. Non-compliant. Dock supports at the wrong angle. Immediate fine. Meanwhile, neighbors got away with neon pink mailboxes and fences tall enough to double as medieval fortifications. Jack realized he wasn't just on Karen's radar, he was the bullseye. Scholars still argue whether HOA boards were designed to foster community spirit or simply to give suburban despots their own private kingdoms. But Karen made the case for the latter every time she lifted her ruler. And it wasn't just petty harassment. Jack noticed her obsession drew a circle around his property. 9 of 14 houses now belonged to her, scooped up at suspiciously cheap prices from families who looked relieved just to escape. The other residents, glassy-eyed and obedient, nodded along to every new bylaw as if they'd been hypnotized. It reminded Jack of Cold War stories about sleeper agents waiting for a signal, and considering his grandfather had been a military engineer, that thought hit uncomfortably close to home. Then came the sound. A faint electronic beeping from somewhere beneath his feet, clockwork, precise 3 quick chirps, 4 minutes of silence, then nothing. Not a smoke detector, not a phone alarm, something older, more deliberate. And Karen. She kept circling back to his basement, asking about electromagnetic interference like it was the most normal thing in the world for a suburban HOA president to care about. It was the kind of curiosity that made Jack's tactical instincts twitch. The last straw came when she showed up with 2 supposed federal contractors, men with bolt cutters, no badges, and accents that belonged more in a Cold War spy novel than on a Michigan driveway. Jack watched them march toward his basement with military precision, Karen smirking like a queen unveiling her checkmate. But then his eyes caught something chilling. Her paperwork included a detailed floor plan of his cabin, with the basement circled in red like a target. That's when he knew this was no HOA drama. This was something far darker, a siege on his grandfather's legacy and maybe on national security itself. The 2 men descended into his basement like they'd rehearsed it 100 times before, measuring walls, muttering in clipped Russian phrases, setting up gear with foreign serial numbers. Real federal agents would have been snapping photos, bagging evidence, calling in chain of custody logs. These guys, they were hunting for something very specific, something they already knew existed. Jack slipped away into his grandfather's study, the kind of cramped wood-paneled room that smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather. Behind a false wall, he found the steel safe he'd always ignored. The combination was etched in the back of his memory from his grandfather's will. He spun the dial, opened it, and there it was, a yellowed legal pad wrapped in oiled cloth. The first line made his blood run cold. "Jack, if you're reading this, they've finally come for Project Sanguine." Turns out the cabin wasn't just a lakeside getaway. It sat on top of a Cold War LF station, an extremely low-frequency transmitter designed to reach submarines buried under oceans. that steady beeping he'd been hearing. It was the heartbeat of the system, confirming that America's nuclear fleet was still breathing. If someone cracked those codes, they could force submarines to surface, exposing billions of dollars in naval firepower to enemy satellites. Historians still argue whether the Cold War ended with a handshake or simply slipped into a digital chess match. But one thing was certain: his grandfather had been playing for keeps. Jack tucked the letter inside his jacket just as the fake contractor stormed through the cabin in frustration. Outside, Karen paced the yard phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting to the tree line like she was waiting for backup. Every so often, she tapped an earpiece that clearly wasn't standard HOA issue. Her confidence was starting to fray. Time wasn't on her side, and Jack knew why. Whatever foreign handler she was answering to had given her a deadline, and she was running out of it fast. 2 days later, she called a mandatory emergency HOA meeting. Jack showed up early and noticed the aromatherapy diffuser puffing sweet-smelling mist into the room. Problem was, this wasn't lavender or chamomile. Within minutes, neighbors who normally bickered about everything were nodding off into eerie calmness. Mrs. Peterson, the loudest voice on the block, sat glassy-eyed, murmuring vague answers about maybe hearing beeping near the lake. Bill Martinez, who had ranted for weeks about interference wrecking his ham radio, suddenly claimed he'd never noticed a thing. It wasn't relaxation, it was erasure. Karen was chemically rewriting the neighborhood's memory, one HOA meeting at a time. Jack faked drowsiness, breathing shallow, covering his nose with his collar. He caught snippets of her phone call outside. The memory modification is working. Subjects show no retention of target signals. That's when it clicked: the families who sold their homes hadn't fled Karen's rules. They'd run before they lost themselves entirely. But the story wasn't done twisting. A black SUV rolled into his driveway at dawn with a DHS logo on the side and a stern woman flashing credentials. She called herself Agent Wells, backed by men in tactical vests and scanners. On paper, it looked airtight: search warrant, judge's signature, official seals. But her refusal to give Jack a case number set off alarms louder than a fire drill in a popcorn factory. He phoned Mike Rodriguez, his old SWAT leader turned FBI, on a burner. Mike's reply was blunt: Jack, nobody from federal law enforcement is in your area. Whoever's in your basement, they're not ours. And then came the revelation that bent this whole story sideways. Karen wasn't the willing villain he thought. Her daughter Emma had been kidnapped 6 months earlier in Prague. The HOA crusade, the foreign handlers, the memory-wiping diffuser, it wasn't ambition. It was coercion, the ugliest kind. She'd been turned into a weapon by people who promised her daughter's life in exchange for betrayal. By the time midnight rolled around, Jack's cabin looked less like a retirement dream and more like a battlefield waiting to erupt. Karen arrived with 3 new men, smooth, precise, the kind of operators who don't need name tags because their weapons do the talking. Leading them was a man who introduced himself as Colonel Petrov. His English was flawless, his posture military, but the chill in his eyes screamed professional elimination. They didn't come to ask. They came to take. Petrov's tech man hooked into the ELF station with equipment meant to crack submarine codes like a safecracker on steroids. Jack's FBI allies had anticipated it, though, turning the basement into a honey trap that would feed false data long enough for backup to close the net. But time ticked like a bomb. Karen's hands trembled as she presented forged documents, her eyes darting to her phone for news of Emma. She was no longer the smug HOA tyrant. She was a mother balancing on the edge of despair. The tension snapped when Petrov activated a jamming device. Lights flickered, comms went dead, and the cabin hummed with electromagnetic static. His intent became horrifyingly clear. If they couldn't steal the codes, they'd destroy the entire station. Demolition charges wired to the system glowed red, a countdown to disaster. Historians still argue whether deterrence depends more on secrecy or spectacle, but one thing's certain: if the ELF station fried, America's submarine fleet would surface like sitting ducks. And then Karen moved. In a burst of raw courage, she lunged at the specialist, ripped the device free, and clutched it to her chest. Emma would never forgive me if I let her death destroy innocent lives, she shouted, tears and defiance mixing in her voice. For the first time, Jack saw her not as the tormentor who measured his mailbox, but as a mother who refused to let her daughter's suffering be in vain. The sound of helicopters roared overhead. FBI hostage rescue rappelled down with textbook precision. Floodlights cut through the static as Mike Rodriguez's voice thundered, "This is the FBI. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons." Petrov surprised everyone by surrendering calmly, almost philosophically, like a man who always knew capture was one of the possible endings. His team followed suit, subdued with the efficiency of agents who'd run this playbook more times than they cared to admit. Emma was rescued hours later in Prague alive, but scarred by months of psychological torture. The footage of her asking first about her mother's safety made seasoned agents blink hard to keep composure. Back at Lakeshore Meadows, residents watched surveillance playback of Karen's chemical manipulations and months-long harassment. Outrage and sympathy clashed, but ultimately they saw her for what she was. A victim caught in a net she could never escape alone. The HOA was dismantled and rebuilt under transparent bylaws. A community legal fund was born, and Karen herself given probation, and counseling was transformed from neighborhood tyrant into a cautionary voice about how power, fear, and manipulation can twist ordinary life into a battlefield. Jack. He took a role consulting with the Department of Defense, guarding other forgotten Cold War relics from being exploited again. 6 months later, Petrov's handler was unmasked. An entire espionage network unraveled, and Karen and Emma, under new identities, started fresh across the lake. Jack often stood on his rebuilt deck, watching them plant flowers, reflecting on how thin the boundary is between villainy and coercion. Karen once asked him, "Do you think I was a hero or a villain?" His answer lingered in the night air. "You were a mother, and mothers will do anything to protect their children. The villains are the ones who force that choice on you." And so the story fades, not with gunfire or glory, but with the quiet image of a lakeside community rediscovering peace. The cicadas hum in the trees, the water ripples against the dock, and the once chaotic cabin breathes calm again. Justice, Jack reflects, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about mercy memory and the courage to forgive what was never freely chosen. Now, as the adrenaline of the standoff dissolves into the hush of the lakeshore, the pace softens. The lights of the tactical trucks are long gone, leaving only the faint silver wash of the moon on the water. The cabin, once stormed by strangers, stands quietly again, its timber walls creaking with the same rhythm his grandfather once heard. For Jack, the silence feels heavier but also kinder, like the lake itself has drawn a deep breath and chosen to keep its secrets one more night. Karen and Emma, though, burdened with scars found in their garden rows of tender sprouts, a kind of fragile hope. Neighbors who had once nodded in fogged compliance now spoke with clarity again, remembering not just who they were, but what they wanted their community to be. The HOA binder that once dictated flower colors and mailbox heights now lay forgotten, replaced by a simple promise that no one person would wield that kind of unchecked power again. Historians may one day argue whether these hidden Cold War relics prolonged peace or merely delayed inevitable storms. But for Jack, the argument mattered less than the quiet now resting across his porch. He thought about mothers and daughters, about choices forced by cruelty, and about the resilience of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary shadows. The lake whispered back that survival is not the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it. So tonight, let the story ease away from gunmetal tension into the calm rhythm of crickets and wind through pines. Imagine that steady beeping under the cabin now muted its duty, fulfilled its signal, no longer calling. Close your eyes, breathe slow, and let the quiet reassure you. Even in the darkest storms, There are moments when mercy rises higher than madness.